The well was 31 feet deep and had been dry since before Willa Hale was born, which was 20 years before she stood at the edge of it in August of 1891, looking down into the dark and trying to understand what her grandmother had meant by leaving it to her. The land was a quarter acre on the back slope of Stone Hollow Ridge in Harlan County, Kentucky. The quarter acre contained in its entirety the well-collapsed chicken coop that had surrendered to gravity at some point in the previous decade, and a hackberry tree that had grown sideways from the slope over many years and now hung above the well opening like a crooked arm reaching down to pull someone in. The deed had arrived by mail 3 weeks after her grandmother Vera died, folded inside a letter from a county clerk who had noted without apparent irony that the property taxes were 14 cents a year and currently paid through 1893. Willa had read the letter twice at the kitchen table in Pikeville. Then she had folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her dress and gone about the rest of the morning as though nothing had changed, because in that kitchen, in that house, she had learned over 6 years that the best way to receive any piece of news was quietly and without expression, so that the man sitting at the head of the table had nothing to respond to. Everett Crane was her sister, Della's husband. He ran a dry goods store on Main Street in Pikeville and had made it understood from the first week of Willa's arrival, when she was 14 years old and her parents had been in the ground for less than a month, that her presence in his house was a temporary arrangement that had somehow calcified into something permanent, and that he considered this a failing of his own generous nature rather than any reflection of genuine obligation. He never said this directly. Everett Crane was not a man who said difficult things directly. He said them through the portion size he served her at dinner, always slightly smaller than the portions given to himself and Della. He said them through the volume at which he closed doors she was standing behind. He said them through the particular way he referred to her in conversation with Della, always as your sister, as though the possessive itself was an indictment, as though the relationship between the two women was a problem that Della had brought into the house without consulting him. On the morning the deed arrived, Everett read it at the breakfast table, set it down with the deliberateness of a man completing a task, and said, "Well, now the girl has land." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The sentence contained everything that 6 years of smaller dinner portions and closed doors had been building toward, and Willa understood it with a completeness that required no translation. She was 20 years old. She had $11 in coins saved in a tin beneath the floorboard under her bed. She had 2 dresses that fit her and one that did not, a wool blanket that had been her mother's, a sewing kit in a wooden box that had been her mother's as well, and a small hand mirror with a silver frame that had belonged to Vera and that Willa had kept in her coat pocket since the funeral, because it was the only thing of Vera's that she had been given before the county clerk's letter arrived. And now she had land. She left Pikeville on the 17th of August with her canvas sack over one shoulder and the tin of coins in the bottom of it, and everything else she owned packed in around it. Della stood on the porch and held her hands and did not say what she wanted to say, which was that she was sorry because saying it would have required acknowledging the things she had been not saying for 6 years, and Della was not built for that kind of reckoning. Instead, she said that Willa should write when she arrived, and Willa said she would, and both of them understood that neither of them meant this in the ordinary way that people mean it when they say it. Everett was not on the porch. The road to Stone Hollow Ridge from the nearest coach stop was 3 miles of gravel and packed clay that climbed through stands of oak and hickory and the occasional pine before breaking out into the open sky of the ridge itself. Willa walked it on the afternoon of the 19th of August. The August heat of Harlan County was not the polite heat of the lowlands. It was the heat of air that had been pressed down between mountains and had nowhere to go, and had been sitting in that compressed state since June, accumulating a density and a persistence that made every uphill step feel like wading through something. By the time she crested the ridge, her dress was dark at the back and her hair had come loose at the temples, and she did not care about any of it. She set her canvas sack down on a flat stone and looked. The quarter acre was real. That was the first thing she confirmed, because some part of her had been half expecting the deed to be a mistake, a misreading, some clerical error that would dissolve on contact with the actual ground. But the ground was there. The hackberry tree was there, growing at its sideways angle from the slope, its branches catching the late afternoon light and throwing moving shadows across the well opening below it. The collapsed chicken coop was there, its boards weathered to the silver gray of old wood that has given up trying to be anything other than what the weather has made it. The well itself was there, a circle of stacked limestone blocks rising 18 inches from the ground. The mortar between them, the dark gray of the Harlan County clay that had been mixed into every structure in the county for as long as anyone had been building things in it. Willa walked to the well and then looked down. The interior was darkness below the first 8 feet where the August light reached. She could see the upper portion of the shaft, clearly the limestone blocks hand-laid with a precision that spoke of someone who had known exactly what they were doing and had done it with the unhurried care of a person building something meant to last. The blocks were tight. The mortar was still solid between them even after decades of freeze and thaw. Whoever had built this well had built it to stand, and it had stood, and the only thing it lacked was the one thing a well was supposed to provide. She took a pebble from the ground and held it over the opening and let it go. She counted. 1, 2, 3. The sound that came back was the sound of stone striking. Dry stone, a small sharp report that echoed once in the shaft and then went quiet. No splash, no hollow resonance of water. Nothing but dry limestone 20 feet down, and the silence of a thing that had been waiting a very long time and had grown accustomed to the waiting. Willa stood at the edge of the well in the August heat and looked down into the dry dark and tried to understand what Vera had intended. Her grandmother had been a woman of deliberate actions. Nothing Vera did was accidental. In 40 years of watching her, Willa had never once seen her do a careless thing, never seen her make a decision she had not already turned over completely in her mind and examined from every angle before committing to it. Vera had been the kind of woman who thought in long arcs, who planted apple trees when she was 60 years old and watered them knowing she would likely never eat the fruit because the planting itself was the point, the act of investment in a future she would not personally occupy. She had left the land to Willa specifically, not to Della, who was older and married and had a house and a husband and a store on Main Street and every visible foundation a life could rest on. To Willa, who had $11 in a canvas sack and no visible foundation of any kind. Vera had done this deliberately. Willa was certain of it in the way she was certain of things that could not yet be proved, in the way that certain knowledge precedes evidence and waits for it to arrive. She picked up her canvas sack and looked for a neighbor. The nearest property to the quarter-acre was a half-mile down the ridge, a farmhouse that announced itself before it came into view by the smell of wood smoke and the sound of chickens conducting their ongoing argument with the world. The house itself came into view as Willa rounded a stand of oak, and it was the kind of house that had been built in stages over many years by different hands, with different ideas about what a house should do, each addition visible as a distinct chapter in the structure's history. The porch that ran along the front of it sagged so deeply in the center that it looked less like architectural feature and more like an expression, as though the house itself had been frowning steadily for so long that the frown had become its resting face. The woman sitting in a chair at the far end of the porch was 63 years old and had the face and posture of someone who had arrived at a settled understanding of the world decades ago and saw no particular reason to revise it. Her hair was white and pinned back without ceremony. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair with the stillness of hands that had done everything they were going to do today and were taking the remaining daylight as what it was, which was a gift that arrived every day and should not be wasted on unnecessary movement. She watched Willow approach from the road with the unblinking attention of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son and had consequently arrived at the view that most things were worth watching and few things were worth panicking about. "You'll be the Hale girl," she said when Willa was close enough that raising her voice would have been unnecessary. "Willa Hale, yes ma'am." "Mabel Finch." She did not offer her hand or stand from her chair. "You'll have come about the quarter-acre." "I have. I'm looking to borrow a rope and a bucket if you have them to spare." Mabel looked at her for a moment in the way she looked at things she was measuring. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm either. The look of a woman who had learned a long time ago to see clearly and not to waste the seeing. "Rope's in the barn," she said. "I'll sell you the bucket for a dime." Willa paid the dime. Mabel led her to the barn with the unhurried pace of a woman who had stopped being in a hurry for anything some years prior and had found the adjustment agreeable. The rope was coiled on a wooden peg inside the door, 30 feet of good hemp still supple. The bucket was tin, slightly dented on one side but sound. As Mabel handed it over, she said as though she were mentioning the weather, "That well's been dry 40 years. My mother used to lower jars of milk down into it to keep them cool. Willa held the bucket and looked at Mabel. How cool. Mabel thought about this for a moment. Cool in August, she said. She said it stayed the same all year, said the temperature never changed. She paused. My mother said a lot of things. Most of them turned out to be true. Willa walked back up the ridge with the rope over her shoulder and the bucket in her hand and the August heat pressing down on her from above and rising up from the clay road beneath her feet. And she thought about what Mabel had said, and she thought about what it meant that the temperature in a dry well might stay the same all year. And she thought about her grandmother planting apple trees at 60 years old, and she kept walking. At the well, she tied the rope to the hackberry tree. The tree's roots had been holding to the ridge slope for decades and were embedded in the limestone bedrock beneath the shallow soil, and the trunk was as solid as any anchor she could have found on the property. She knotted the rope every 2 feet for grip. She tested her weight against the knot at the tree twice before she trusted it. She lit the candle she had tucked into her apron pocket before leaving Pikeville, because some part of her had understood, in the way that understanding sometimes precedes its own occasion, that she was going to need it. She sat on the edge of the well, swung her legs over, found the rope with both hands, and lowered herself into the shaft. The upper 8 feet were warm with trapped afternoon heat. The limestone blocks past her hands on either side, dry and faintly dusty, the mortar lines even and precise in the candlelight. She descended slowly, testing each foothold, feeling the rope take her weight through the knotted intervals. At 10 feet, the heat stopped. It did not taper. It did not gradually give way to something cooler. It simply stopped as abruptly as walking through a doorway from summer into a room that has been closed and kept. The air that replaced it was cool and still, and carried a smell unlike anything she had encountered at the surface, a mineral smell, clean and faintly sweet, the smell of deep limestone and the dark and the particular quality of air that has not been disturbed in a long time. She descended through it and felt it settle against her skin like something that had been waiting patiently. At 20 feet, the shaft widened slightly. The candle flame stood straight and steady. No draft. The air was absolutely still. At 26 feet, where the hand-laid limestone blocks ended and the raw rock face of the ridge began, her boots found a ledge, not the bottom of the shaft. A ledge extending to the left beyond the shaft wall into darkness that the candle had not yet reached. Willa held the rope with one hand and extended the candle with the other. The light moved across the space below and around her, and what it revealed was not the bottom of a dry well. The well shaft had been sunk directly into the top of a natural limestone cavity. The cavity extended roughly 15 feet to the south and 12 feet to the east. The ceiling arched 8 feet above a floor of smooth pale limestone that had been worn flat by water over millennia and had been dry for long enough that every trace of moisture was gone from its surface. The walls were pale gray and solid, the natural limestone formations of the Appalachian Ridge in their most basic form, without ornamentation and without apology. The air temperature was 54 degrees. She could feel it on her face and hands, with the specificity that cold air has when it is encountered unexpectedly, the precise and unmistakable sensation of temperature that has reached an equilibrium and intends to hold it. It was the temperature of deep earth, the temperature of the planet's own interior, expressing itself at the surface through stone, constant and independent of the seasons above. Willa lowered herself the rest of the way onto the ledge and then down to the cavity floor, her boots finding solid limestone beneath them. She straightened and held the candle up and turned slowly in the space, taking inventory in the way she had always taken inventory, systematically, without hurrying, letting the information accumulate before forming conclusions. In the far corner of the south wall, a thin seam of water seeped down the rock face in a line so fine it was less a flow than a suggestion of one collecting in a natural basin at the base of the wall, a depression the size and shape of a wash basin that had been formed by the same water over the same long period of time that had flattened the floor. The basin was full. The water that overflowed it disappeared into a crack in the floor and drained into whatever darkness lay below. The seeping water kept the air in the southeast corner slightly more humid than the rest of the space, and in that corner the smell was strongest, that mineral sweetness of Harlan County limestone that she would spend years learning to identify as the specific signature of this particular depth and this particular stone. Along the south wall, she saw the shelf. It was not a natural formation. The limestone of the south wall had been worked not by water, but by iron, and the working had been done carefully and with knowledge of the material. A horizontal shelf extended from the wall at waist height, roughly 5 feet long and 8 inches deep, its surface chiseled flat with the precision of someone who understood that flat surfaces needed to be truly flat to be useful. Above the shelf, 3 iron nails had been driven into the rock face and bent downward at their tips, forming hooks. The nails were rusted dark red and had been in the wall long enough that the rust itself had established an equilibrium and was progressing no further. They had held something heavy for a long time. The stone around them carried the faint, dark staining of weight and use. The floor beneath the shelf was stained in a pattern that spread across 2 feet of limestone in the irregular shape of something spilled and absorbed slowly over many seasons. The stain was dark and ambiguous in the candlelight, the kind of mark that could have been oil, could have been tallow, could have been the accumulated drippings of 100 wheels of cheese aged at 54 degrees through the cycle of decades that the shaft above had witnessed without participating in. Willa stood in the cavity for a long time. She stood there until the candle had burned down a third of its length, and the quality of the silence around her had become something she could feel rather than simply note. The silence 40 feet underground was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something that had been here longer than she had been alive, longer than her grandmother had been alive, longer than any of the names she carried from her family's history. It was geological silence, the silence of stone that had been forming itself in the dark since before there were people to make noise in it. At 54 degrees in the perfect dark, she thought about what her grandmother had left her. She climbed back up. She sat on the edge of the well in the late afternoon light and looked at the hackberry tree and the ridge and the August sky going orange above the mountain to the west, and she let the warmth come back into her hands and her face, and she thought with the methodical precision that had been her grandmother's greatest gift to her, the only tool Vera had taught her by example every day of her childhood. She needed a thermometer. She needed a lantern. She needed rope, more of it, and a proper pulley system. She needed the chisels and the hammer. She needed time, and she had it. She had all the time that the quarter-acre of Stone Hollow Ridge afforded, which was to say as much time as she was willing to spend on it on her own terms, without anyone to tell her the portions were too small or closed doors behind her. She stood up, dusted her skirt, picked up Mabel Finch's bucket, and began walking back down the ridge. The following morning, she went to the Harlan General Store 3 miles down the valley and spent $4.20 of her $11. She bought a tin thermometer for 60 cents. She bought a 2-pound hammer for 40 cents. She bought a cold chisel for 30 cents and a second one for 30 cents. She bought 20 feet of additional rope for 90 cents. She bought enough cornmeal and dried beans and salt pork to last 6 weeks for $1.70. She walked back with the supplies in her canvas sack and in 2 additional flour sacks she had bought for a nickel each, and the walking was uphill, and the August heat had not moderated its opinion of the situation, and she did not hurry. She had learned in 6 years in Everett Crane's house that hurrying communicated something she did not want to communicate anymore, which was that she was afraid of running out of time before something was accomplished. She was not afraid of that anymore. She had all the time on Stone Hollow Ridge that she had never been given anywhere else. On the 22nd of August, she went back to Mabel Finch's property and knocked on the porch frame because the porch door was open and knocking on air was the closest available equivalent. Mabel appeared from inside in the way she appeared, places without sound and without announcement, as though she had simply decided to be present somewhere, and presence had followed. "I want to show you what I found at the bottom of the well," Willa said. She told it simply and in order because that was how it deserved to be told. The change in temperature at 10 feet. The ledge at 26 feet where the hand-laid stone ended. The cavity below its dimensions, its ceiling, its smooth, dry floor. The shelf in the south wall, the iron hooks, the staining on the floor. When she finished, Mabel was quiet for long enough that a person who did not know her might have wondered if she had been listening. "Vera knew about that cave," Mabel said finally. Her voice had the same quality it always had, level and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had long since stopped needing to perform any emotion she was not actually experiencing. "She used to keep cheese down there, aged it on the stone shelf, said the temperature never changed." "How long?" 30 years, maybe longer. Her mother before her, I think, but Vera didn't say much about that. Mabel looked at this ridge above them, at the line of the hackberry tree visible against the sky from this distance. She always said the place had a constancy to it that the surface didn't have. Said things held their character down there in a way they couldn't hold it up top. Willa thought about this. What happened to the cheese operation? Vera's knees went bad. She couldn't manage the shaft anymore by the time she was 70. She kept meaning to rig something easier and never did. Mabel paused. She always said she'd leave it to someone who could use it. Took her a while to work out who that was. Willa nodded once and said nothing because the sentence contained something she was not yet ready to respond to directly. She had known since the morning the deed arrived that Vera deliberately had chosen her over Della, with her husband and her store and her visible foundations. But knowing a thing and hearing it spoken by another person were different experiences, and the difference required a moment. She spent September building. The first project was the shelf. She descended the shaft every morning at first light with the hammer and the cold chisel and worked on the stone of the south wall until her arms told her to stop, which in the beginning was not long. The limestone of Harlan County was not soft. It had been formed under pressure over millions of years, and it had strong opinions about being chiseled. Each strike of the hammer sent a report through the cavity that came back a half-second later from the far wall echo, following echo, the percussion of iron on stone, filling the underground space with a sound unlike any she had heard before, both lonely and alive. The limestone dust settled on her hair and her shoulders and the creases of her knuckles and the lines around her eyes and in her eyelashes until she looked when she climbed out each morning like a woman who had aged 30 years during the descent. She rinsed her face at the seeping water basin on the south wall and climbed out coughing and continued. She widened the entry ledge at the base of the shaft where it met the cavity floor, chipping away the lip of stone that required a careful step to navigate, creating a passage that would accommodate a loaded bucket without the bucket catching on the edges. This took 4 days, and she counted the days by the amount of gravel she hauled out, which was considerable. She leveled the cavity floor. This was the work of a different kind of patience, the patience of repetition rather than the patience of precision. She filled the natural low spots with gravel she carried down in the bucket load, after load, 27 trips a day for 9 days. 243 trips total, each one a descent into the cool, constant dark, and a climb back into the August heat that hit her face at the rim of the well like opening an oven door. She learned to rest her forearms on the edge for a moment each time she surfaced, letting her body remember where it was before continuing. She built a sleeping platform against the south wall from the scrap lumber she had bought from the sawmill in Harlan for 7-cent boards, too warped for construction, but entirely adequate for a bed frame raised 18 inches from the stone floor. She fitted the boards together with the dovetail joints her father had taught her before he died, the joints that required no nails and held their shape through expansion and contraction, and she wedged the frame against the wall at 2 points so it would not shift on the smooth limestone. She lined the platform with cedar boughs she cut from the trees on the slope above the well, filling the sleeping surface to a depth of 4 inches, and covered the boughs with her mother's wool blanket. The cedar smell filled the cavity and mingled with the mineral scent of the limestone and the faint sweetness of the seeping water, and the combination was unlike any smell she had encountered before. On the last nail in the south wall above the shelf, she hung Vera's hand mirror. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 3 weeks since the morning she had taken it from the drawer in Vera's bedroom before the county clerk arrived to assess the estate. It was a small oval mirror with a silver frame, the silver darkened with age to the color of old pewter. The back of the frame was engraved with initials that were not Vera's, which meant it had been handed down from someone before Vera, though no one had ever told Willa who. She hung it on the nail and held the candle up. The single flame multiplied in the polished surface and scattered its reflections across the cavity walls, and for a moment the underground space filled with warm light that moved as the candle moved, light that suggested a fire rather than a single small flame, light that made the pale limestone walls seem to breathe. Willa stood in the center of the cavity with her hammer in one hand and the candle in the other, and understood for the first time in several weeks what the space she was building was. It was not a storage facility. It was not simply a cold room or a cellar or an agricultural convenience. It was a place. It was a place that had been made by someone who understood both the practical value of constant temperature and the human value of a space that belonged entirely to the person who had found it. She went up and came down and went up again, and in this rhythm, September passed. The tin thermometer she had bought at the Harlan General Store, she hung from an iron hook with a piece of string and checked every morning and every evening at the same time, noting the reading in the small ledger she had bought for 3 cents. 54 in the morning, 54 in the evening. The surface temperature swung between 45 at night and 78 in the afternoons as September settled into early October, and the cavity held at 54 through every swing and every gray morning and every warm afternoon and every night when the ridge wind came down from the mountains and bent the hackberry tree sideways over the well opening. 54, 54, 54. 2 weeks of readings in the ledger, and she could see what she had, not a dry well, a constant. It was in this same September, between the descents and the chiseling and the gravel work, that she turned her attention to the collapsed chicken coop. The structure had given up its original purpose long before she arrived, but the materials it had surrendered to the ground were still sound, in the way that old Harlan County timber was often sound dried through and hardened by years of mountain weather into something more durable than it had been when first cut. She sorted the boards by length and condition, discarding what had rotted through and keeping what had merely weathered, and she spent the last 2 weeks of September rebuilding a single room from the best of what remained. It was not large. It measured 12 feet by 10 feet, which was adequate for a stove and a table and a shelf for the ledger and a sleeping pallet that she would use on the nights when the cold made the descent impractical. The door latched from the inside with a simple bar mechanism she fashioned from a length of iron she bought at the Harlan Hardware for 8 cents. The single window faced the ridge and was covered with oiled cloth rather than glass, which let the light through and kept the wind out with reasonable effectiveness. She chinked the gaps between the boards with the same gray clay that had mortared the original well blocks, mixing it with dry grass for binding in the way she had seen her father do with his outbuildings in Ohio. It was not what most people would have called a house. It was what the quarter-acre required, and it was hers, and those two qualities made it sufficient. In October, she bought the goat. The farmer who sold her was 3 miles down the valley, a man with a face like cracked clay, and the specific weariness of someone who had been woken up one too many times by an animal standing on the roof of his chicken coop. He had advertised the animal for $3, and Willa offered $2.25, and he took it without argument, because the relief in his face when she led the animal off his property made it clear that the price had not been the primary concern. The goat was a small nanny of no particular distinguished breeding, brown and white, with amber eyes that looked at everything with an expression of philosophical assessment and floppy ears that moved independently like small antennae tracking separate signals. She had been named Pancake by the farmer's youngest son, and Willa renamed her Juniper. On the walk back up the ridge, not out of any particular attachment to the name, but because the animal paused at the first juniper bush they passed and ate a measured quantity of its needles with an air of deep satisfaction that suggested a relationship of long standing. She built Juniper a pen from the remaining boards of the collapsed coop that she had not used for the room, fitting the weathered lumber together into a structure that would not win any architectural awards, but would reliably contain a goat of ordinary motivation, which this goat was not. On the first morning, Juniper was standing on the roof of the pen. On the second morning, she had removed one of the boards from the north face and was conducting an inspection of the quarter-acre with the thoroughness of a new property owner. Willa repaired the board and added a second layer across the lower section of all 4 walls. On the third morning, the pen held, and Juniper stood inside it looking at the modifications with the expression of a creature who had taken note. The goat produced 1.5 quarts of milk each day through the autumn, reliable as the cavity temperature morning and evening in equal portions. Willa milked her in the first light before anything else needed doing, and in the fading light at the end of the afternoon, and the milk went into the covered jars she lowered to the cavity floor on the rope, where 54 degrees kept it fresh for 5 days instead of the 2 days it would have held at surface temperature. In November, she made her first wheel of cheese. The recipe came from Mabel Finch, who had produced it from memory one Thursday morning, without being asked, reciting it in the same level tone she used for everything else, as though the production of cheese from goat's milk were simply another item in the wing list of things she had observed the world required and had therefore acquired the knowledge to provide. The recipe involved a vinegar and cheesecloth and a patience that was less about waiting and more about attention about monitoring, without interfering about trusting the process to do what it was going to do if given the right conditions. The right conditions, as it turned out, were precisely 54 degrees and darkness and time. The cheese set in 12 hours at the cavity temperature. It held its shape on the cloth in a way that cheese made at surface temperature in October rarely held its shape, because a spring house fluctuated with the weather, and the cavity did not fluctuate at all. And it turned out that cheese, like many things, benefited from consistency more than from any particular treatment. She wrapped the first wheel in clean cheesecloth, loaded it into her canvas sack, with the other items she had prepared for the Harlan Saturday market, and walked the 3 miles into town in the November cold, with her sack over her shoulder and her breath making small clouds in the air ahead of her. The Harlan Saturday market occupied the lower end of Main Street from 7 in the morning until noon, the stalls ranging from produce and preserved goods on the north end to livestock and equipment on the south, with the informal hierarchy that such markets develop naturally over years of operation. The most established vendors in the best positions, the newer arrivals working from whatever space remained. Willa sat up at the edge of the market with her canvas sack and her wheel of goat cheese and a piece of brown paper she had written the price on with a pencil. 35 cents. She sold it within the first hour to a woman named Opal Riggs, who ran the boarding house on Depot Street and fed 12 men breakfast and dinner 6 days a week, and consequently had strong and well-developed opinions about the quality of dairy products. Opal had picked up the wheel, examined it, pressed the surface with one finger, smelled it, and replaced it on the paper with the expression of a person who had conducted an evaluation and arrived at a conclusion. "Where is it aged?" she asked. "Under," Willa said. Opal Riggs looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once with the finality of a person closing a transaction and paid the 35 cents. And that was the entirety of the conversation about the origin of the cheese, which suited Willa entirely. The following Saturday, Opal came back and bought two. She told Willa that the cheese held its shape when sliced, did not sweat in the pantry, and was noticeably better on the third day than it had been on the first, which was a quality that no other cheese she had purchased in Harlan County had ever demonstrated, and that she intended to take full advantage of for as long as it remained available. She mentioned this while examining the wheels with the same thorough assessment she had applied to the first one, and Willa listened and filed the information in the part of her mind that was still building the picture of what she had and what it could do. Mabel Finch came to the well every Thursday. She came at the same time each week, mid-morning, and she did not knock or announce herself because there was nothing to knock on, and no particular reason for announcement, since Willa was the only person on the property and could be presumed to know that Mabel was there by the sound of her boots on the slope. She never climbed down the shaft. Her knees had made their position on that subject clear, and she respected it. Instead, she sat on the edge of the well with her legs hanging into the opening and lowered a wooden basket on a length of rope that she had tied to the hackberry tree at a separate point from Willa's main rope. In the basket came things she had decided Willa needed without being asked. A cast iron skillet that she had replaced with a newer one and saw no reason to retire when it was still entirely functional. A jar of blackberry preserves from the summer's canning. A pair of wool socks she had knitted from the end of a skein that had been taking up space in her sewing basket. A copy of a farming almanac from 1887 with 3 pages that dealt in the terse and practical prose of agricultural writing of the period, with the management of underground cheese caves in France, their temperature requirements, their humidity levels, their production capacities. Willa sent things back up in the basket, a wheel of cheese, a jar of goat's milk. Later, when the mushroom operation had begun, a bag of oyster mushrooms with their pale layered surfaces still carrying the deep smell of damp wood and earth. They talked while the basket traveled between them. Mabel's voice carried down the shaft in the same unhurried tone it always had, as though the stone walls were simply a different kind of room, and the distance between them was nothing that required raising the volume of what she said. Willa learned to hear her in the intervals between the creak of the rope and the scrape of the basket against the limestone, the words arriving like everything Mabel offered at their own pace and without apology. It was on one of these Thursdays in the second month of Willa's residence on the ridge that Mabel told her about the war. She did not lead into it. She did not preface it with any announcement that she was about to say something important. She simply said it in the middle of a sentence that had been about the correct aging time for for the soft cheese variety Willa had been developing. Vera used this cave during the war, she said, and Willa heard it come down the shaft with the same level quality as everything else, Mabel said, and she held the candle still and listened. It was the autumn of 1863. The armies had been moving through the mountains for 2 years, both sides needing what the county could provide, both sides willing to take it whether provided or not. The foraging parties came through the valley without warning and without much interest in the distinction between willing and unwilling contribution. They took what they saw: grain, livestock, preserved food equipment, anything with practical value to men moving through difficult country in insufficient supply of everything. Vera had seen them coming from the ridge 3 days before they arrived in the valley. The dust of their movement visible in the distance, the particular character of that movement, identifiable to anyone who had been watching long enough to know the difference between a wagon train and a military column. She had spent those 3 days lowering everything into the cavity. Every jar of preserved fruit and vegetables from the summer's work, the cured hams from the smokehouse, the seed grain she had been keeping separate from the feed grain, with the understanding that one was food for the winter and the other was food for next year. The cheese already aging on the shelf, the salt she had been accumulating all summer, because salt was the difference between a winter with enough food and a winter without it. All of it went down the shaft on the rope in covered containers stacked carefully on the cavity floor and the shelf covered with cloth and left to the steady 54 degrees, while the soldiers walked through the property above and found what there was to find, which by that point was not much. They were thorough, the soldiers. They were not by the accounts that survived particularly cruel. They were hungry men doing what hungry men with orders do, which is to find food and take it without spending too much time on the philosophy of the transaction. They looked in the obvious places. They did not look in the well, because wells were wells, and dry wells were worth even less than working ones. What they also did not find was the man in the cavity. His name was never recorded in anything Vera left behind, and Mabel did not know it. He was a Union soldier separated from his unit in the mountain, fighting 2 weeks before the foraging party arrived with a wound in his left leg that had been badly treated in the field and had spent 2 weeks becoming something more serious than the original injury. Vera had found him on the ridge dehydrated and running a fever that had reached the point where judgment was becoming unreliable and the body's options were narrowing. She had brought him to the well. She had not done this because it was safe. She had done it because it was the only available choice, and she had assessed all the available choices in the time it took to make the decision, which was not long. The cavity was 54 degrees and had clean water from the seeping basin, and no one else who knew about it besides Mabel who could be trusted completely. It could accommodate a man lying down on a surface that would keep him at a stable temperature that fever could not explain away. It could conceal him from searches that had no reason to look underground. He stayed for 3 weeks. He came out when the leg had healed sufficiently that walking was possible and the fever had broken entirely, and he could make decisions about where he was going and how he was going to get there. He went south, which Vera thought was probably in the wrong direction given his stated intentions, but she did not feel that her role extended to directing his navigation. She had kept him alive and fed him and kept him cool when the fever ran high and given him 3 weeks of darkness and constant temperature in which to mend, and that was what the situation had required. He was not the only secret the cave had kept, Mabel said, but he was the one Vera talked about, the one that had required the most from her and given back the most in the sense that matters, the sense of having done the exact right thing in circumstances that made the exact right thing difficult to identify and more difficult to execute. Willa stood in the cavity with the candle and let the information settle into the walls around her, into the shelf and the iron hooks and the staining on the floor. And she thought about the well above, and the hackberry tree above that, and the ridge above that, and the sky above that. And she thought about the fact that none of it looked like anything from the surface. None of it had ever looked like anything from the surface. That was the point. That had always been the point. The cave was not a hiding place because Vera had been afraid. The cave was a resource in the deepest sense of the word, a reserve of constancy and concealment that a woman alone in Harlan County had identified and maintained and used for 30 years before the war, made its value unmistakable, and 20 years after the war had simply continued to make things that could be kept without being seen, things that could grow without being watched, things that could accumulate their value in the dark at 54 degrees, while the surface of the world conducted its ordinary business of claiming what it could see. Willa climbed up that evening and sat on the edge of the well in the fading October light and thought for a long time. She thought about Vera planting apple trees at 60. She thought about Vera writing the deed in Willa's name and not Della's, about the specific nature of that choice and what it said about what Vera had understood about both of them. Della had Everett Crane and the dry goods store and the porch and the visible foundations. Willa had nothing visible at all and would therefore need something hidden. She had found it. The hackberry tree's shadow moved across the well opening as the sun dropped behind the mountain, and Willa watched the shadow move and made no effort to hurry it. She had learned in the cavity below what 54 degrees felt like when it was yours, when the constancy of it was something you had earned and built and understood completely. She had learned what it meant to have a thing that was entirely your own and entirely invisible to anyone who had not been told exactly what they were looking at. She picked up the rope and checked the knots and made note of the place near the third knot, where the hemp was beginning to show wear, and she added a new rope to the list in her ledger, and she went inside to make her supper, because the work did not wait for a person to finish thinking, and the thinking could continue while the work was being done, and the work itself was, after all, the point. The first year taught Willa things that no amount of planning could have taught her, because planning operates on assumptions, and the cavity below Stone Hollow Ridge did not conform to assumptions. It conformed to its own logic, the logic of constant temperature and perpetual dark, and the particular chemistry of Harlan County limestone. And the longer Willa worked within that logic, the more clearly she could see what it made possible. She expanded the cheese operation in November and December, adding a second wheel to the aging shelf alongside the first, then a third, working with the recipe Mabel had given her and adjusting it incrementally as she learned the variables. The vinegar ratio, the pressing time, the precise moment when the curd had reached the consistency that would hold through the aging process without either collapsing or hardening beyond usefulness. Each wheel that came out wrong was information. Each wheel that came out right was also information, and the information accumulated in her ledger alongside the temperature readings and the sales figures and the supply calculations, a growing body of knowledge that was entirely her own, because no one else had been paying attention to the same things in the same place. By December, she had 6 regular customers at the Harlan Saturday Market. Opal Riggs remained the anchor of the operation, buying 2 wheels every week without variation and without complaint, and mentioning the cheese to the men she fed with the casual authority of someone who had formed an opinion and saw no reason to keep it to herself. 3 of the other 5 customers came to Willa's market position because Opal had said something to someone who had said something to someone else, and 2 came because they had seen the wheels on the table and picked them up and pressed the surface with a finger, the way Opal had done that first Saturday, applying the same instinctive quality assessment that anyone who had been buying food in a rural market for a long time applied automatically. None of them asked where the cheese was aged after the first time. The first time most of them asked. Willa answered the same way she had answered Opal. Under. The word landed differently on different people. Some nodded immediately, accepting it as the kind of answer that a competent person gives when they have decided the full answer is their own business. Some looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested they were deciding whether to press the matter, and then decided not to, perhaps because the quality of what they were holding in their hands made the production method seem less important than the result. One man, a hotel owner from the center of town, who introduced himself as running the dining room for guests coming up from Lexington and Louisville, looked at her with an expression she could only describe as professionally satisfied. They expect something different from what the local farms produce, he said. Something that tastes like it was made with more intention. It was, Willa said. He ordered 4 wheels per week and paid 40 cents each, a premium that he offered without being asked, and that Willa accepted without expression, because expressing anything about it would have been a waste of time that could be spent on the work. In January, she began keeping root vegetables. The idea came from the same observation that had produced every other development in the cavity, which was the observation of what happened when you gave something the right conditions and then left it alone. She had noticed in December that a turnip she had accidentally left on the cavity floor for 2 weeks was firmer and crisper than it had been when she brought it down, which was the opposite of what turnips did at a surface temperature in December, where they softened and lost their sweetness with every passing week in a root cellar that froze and thawed with every change in the weather. 54 degrees did not freeze. It did not thaw. It did not fluctuate with the weather because it was not subject to the weather. It was the temperature of the earth itself below the level where seasons had any authority, and vegetables stored at 54 degrees in the dark stayed exactly as they were when they entered or became slightly better, as though the constant conditions had finally given them permission to rest. She built wooden crates from scrap lumber, filling them with dry sawdust that Mabel sent down in the basket from her barn, and she packed carrots standing upright so they did not touch each other, and potatoes in single layers with air between them, and turnips wrapped individually in sheets of newspaper that Mabel saved from the mail delivery and brought to the well every other week in a flour sack. The organization of the root storage took up the north wall of the cavity, arranged by type, and by the date she had brought each batch down so she could rotate the stock in the correct order, and nothing would be forgotten at the back of a crate while the front was being depleted. In March, when everyone else's winter stores were softening and sprouting in cellars that had frozen through in January and never quite recovered, she was selling carrots at the Harlan market for 8 cents a pound. The autumn price had been 4 cents. Hers were firm and sweet, and she sold out by 9 in the morning and walked home with an empty sack and more coins than she had brought down from the ridge on any previous Saturday. Nobody asked why her carrots were still crisp in March. They were past asking. They had reached the unspoken agreement that Willa offered, and all her customers had gradually accepted, which was that the quality spoke for itself and the method was her own business. And the transaction between them was simply the exchange of what she produced for what they offered. And that exchange was fair, and fairness was the only part of the arrangement that required any further attention. It was in February of 1892 that Mabel arrived at the well with a wooden crate. She came on a Thursday as she always did, but this Thursday she was not carrying the regular basket. She was carrying a crate that required both hands and a careful gait down the slope, and she set it on the limestone rim of the well with the deliberateness of someone who has been thinking about a thing for a while and has finally determined that the thinking has been completed and the action should follow. Inside the crate were 3 canvas bags of sawdust. Packed within the sawdust were 24 logs, each one roughly the diameter of a man's forearm and 2 feet long, their bark surface interrupted at intervals by small paper plugs sealed with wax. The logs were dense and slightly heavier than their size suggested, and they had the smell of wood that had been kept in a closed space for a long time. Mabel said, "My second husband inoculated these before he died. Oyster mushroom spawn pressed into holes in the bark and sealed. He said they needed cool and dark and damp to fruit. They've been in my root cellar for 3 years, and I've been waiting for conditions I don't have." She looked at the well opening. "That cave of yours is all 3, she said. Willa lowered the logs to the cavity floor in sections, rigging a second rope alongside the primary line to handle the extra weight, and arranged them along the east wall where the seeping water from the south basin kept the air slightly more humid than the rest of the space. She laid them on a bed of sawdust from Mabel's bags, elevated slightly on flat stones so air could circulate beneath them, and she did nothing further to them because Mabel had said they needed cool and dark and damp, and she had provided all 3, and the rest was the log's business. She checked them every morning when she descended to check the thermometer and attend to the cheese and the stored vegetables. For the first 2 weeks, nothing changed. The bark surface remained bark, the wax plugs held, the logs sat in their arrangement against the east wall, and waited at 54 degrees in the dark, the way everything in the cavity waited without urgency and without complaint. On the 28th day, she held the candle close to the nearest log and saw white. It was a small emergence, a cluster no larger than a silver dollar. At this point, pale and layered, the individual caps overlapping like the pages of a book being fanned open. She held the candle closer, and the smell reached her deep and clean, and unlike anything she had encountered below ground before bread dough and wet forest floor, and something earthier underneath both the fundamental smell of fungus doing what fungus does in darkness and moisture and the right temperature. She did not harvest it that day. She let it develop for 3 more days, checking it each morning, watching it expand into a cluster the size of her fist, then 2 fists, the individual caps broadening and flattening, and developing the pale gray-white color of oyster mushrooms in their prime. When the edges of the outermost caps had begun to curl slightly upward, which was the moment Mabel had described as the correct harvest point, she cut them at the base with her pocket knife and laid them in the flat basket she had woven from willow strips she had cut from the creek at the base of the ridge. 2 pounds from the first flush of one log. 23 logs remained untouched on the east wall. She carried the basket up and rewrapped the mushrooms in a clean cloth and added them to the Saturday sack, and on the first Saturday of March 1892, she stood at her market position in Harlan, with 2 wheels of cheese and 1.5 pounds of oyster mushrooms and a crate of March carrots, and the mushrooms were gone in 45 minutes. Fresh mushrooms in February, one woman said, lifting a cluster from the basket and turning it in the morning light. In Harlan County, in the dead of winter. Willa said nothing. The woman bought the full half-pound she had picked up and told 2 other women at adjacent stalls what she had found, and both of them came over, and by the time the market closed at noon, there was not a mushroom left, and Willa had the names of 4 customers who wanted to place standing orders for whatever quantity she could provide going forward. Opal Riggs had bought a full pound and served them that evening, sautéed in butter to the men she boarded, and 3 of them had asked where she had gotten fresh mushrooms in the dead of winter. And she had said a woman on Stone Hollow Ridge, and they had nodded and eaten their dinner. And that had been the end of the inquiry, which was also the end of every inquiry anyone directed at Opal about Willa's products, because Opal had established early on that the answer to the question of origins was the woman on the ridge, and the answer to the question of how was none of your particular business. The smoking rack came in 1893. It was the logical extension of the cold storage operation. The recognition that 54 degrees in perpetual darkness was not only the correct environment for aging dairy and holding vegetables, but was also, with the addition of smoke, the correct environment for curing meat in a way that combined the preserving chemistry of smoke with the stabilizing effect of constant low temperature. The combination produced something different from surface smoking, where the temperature varied with the weather and the curing process was never entirely consistent. In the cavity, the meat hung at 54 degrees in air that moved only slightly and smoke that distributed itself evenly across the stone ceiling before descending slowly through the hanging cuts to exit through whatever path it found. The exit path was the problem she had spent 3 weeks solving before she drove the first hook into the cavity ceiling. She had identified it by holding a candle flame at every crack and fissure in the east wall until she found one where the flame deflected, where the air moving through the stone was strong enough to affect a candle flame at 6 inches of distance. The fissure was at the base of the east wall, where it met the floor barely wide enough to admit 2 fingers, but it connected to something that led eventually to the surface because the air it admitted in winter was slightly colder than the cavity temperature, and the air it exhaled in summer was slightly warmer. It was a natural ventilation path, slow and limited, but real, and real was what she needed. She built a smoke delivery system from clay. Harlan County had the gray clay in every hillside, the same clay that had mortared the original well blocks, and it shaped in the hands with the compliance of a material that understood what was being asked of it. She formed the pipe sections by hand, each one 18 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, smoothing the interior surface carefully because roughness created turbulence, and she wanted the smoke to move steadily. She fired them in a pit on the surface, building the fire from hardwood charcoal and letting it burn for 6 hours before adding the clay sections and covering the pit to hold the heat. 6 sections went down the shaft and were fitted together at the cavity ceiling height, entering through a hole she had chiseled in the shaft wall at the point where the hand-laid stone ended and the natural rock began. The pipe connected to a small firebox she built at the surface level of the shaft, set back from the opening and covered with a fitted stone cap that controlled the airflow and therefore controlled the smoke density in the pipe below. The smoke entered this cavity at ceiling height, spread across the stone, and descended through the hanging cuts of venison and pork she had arranged on the iron rack she had assembled from hooks driven into the ceiling with the same 2-pound hammer that had chiseled the shelf extension and widened the entry ledge. The hammer that had cost 40 cents and by this point had earned back its price more times than she had stopped to count. The smoke exited through the east wall fissure and emerged from a crack in the hillside 40 feet from the well opening at the base of an outcropping that channeled the thin pale exhaust upward, where it dispersed against the sky. From any distance greater than 10 feet, it was indistinguishable from the morning ground fog that settled into the hollows of Stone Hollow Ridge from October through April, the natural exhalation of cold ground meeting warmer air, a feature of the landscape that anyone familiar with the mountain country would recognize immediately and dismiss without further consideration. The smoked meat was unlike what she had tasted from surface operations. It was dense and dark and held its structure when cut, the fibers compressed by the slow even smoking into something that sliced cleanly and held its flavor over months at 54 degrees, the smoke and the temperature working together to produce a preservation that was both more complete and more subtle than either could have achieved independently. She sold it wrapped in cheesecloth at the Saturday market under the only label she ever made, a small card written in pencil in her careful hand. Well-aged. The customers who bought it understood the words as a reference to quality to the craft and patience of the production process. Willa understood them as a literal and precise description of exactly what had happened to the meat, which was that it had been aged in a well at 54 degrees in the dark for the period of time necessary to become what it was. And the label was entirely accurate in every possible interpretation, and she saw no reason to use more words than that. By the end of her first full year, 1892, her income from the quarter acre of Stone Hollow Ridge was $68. She wrote the number in the ledger and looked at it for a long time. Not with sentimentality, because sentimentality was not useful, and she had no particular patience for things that were not useful. She looked at it as information. The average teacher's salary in Harlan County was $60 a year. The figure Everett Crane had spent on her food and board during 6 years in his house, she had calculated once during a sleepless night in the second month of her residence on the ridge, working backward from the cost of provisions and the minimum square footage of the room she had occupied, and the number she had arrived at was $31 a year. She had looked at that number and then at her own ledger figure, and then she had closed both the ledger and the line of thought and had not returned to either calculation again. The numbers told their own story. The numbers were sufficient. It was the spring of 1895 that brought Silas Trent to the Harlan Saturday market. Willa noticed him the way she noticed everything at the market that was outside the ordinary pattern of the operation, which was to say, she noticed him immediately and without appearing to notice him at all. He was not a local man. His clothes said Lexington, not in the way of a man who had put on his best for a trip to town, but in the way of a man for whom these clothes were simply what he wore, because they were what he owned, the casual indifference to expense that came from having enough of it, that expense had stopped being a consideration. He was 45 years old or thereabouts, with the compact physical authority of a man who had learned to occupy space efficiently and had been practicing it for a long time. His hair was the dark brown of Harlan County oak bark in autumn, and his eyes were the particular gray that is not cold exactly, but is not warm either, the gray of overcast sky before snow, the gray of a calculation in progress. He walked the length of the market once before stopping near Willa's position, and the walk was not the walk of a man looking for produce. He was looking at the stalls the way she had learned to look at the cavity measurements, systematically gathering information before forming conclusions, noting the arrangement in the quantities, in the customers, in the patterns of movement and transaction. He was reading the market as a document. He stopped near her position and did not look at her products. He looked at her customers. He watched Opal Riggs pick up a wheel of cheese and pay for it without asking the price. He watched the hotel owner from the center of town hand Willa an envelope containing the week's payment for his standing order. He watched two women she had not seen before approach the table and buy mushrooms. After a brief exchange she could not hear from where she was standing, but the transaction took less than 30 seconds, which meant there had been no negotiation about price or quality, which meant the women already knew what they were buying and had come specifically for it. He watched all of this, and then he walked away. He did not come to her table. He did not buy anything. He did not introduce himself. He simply watched with the gray eyes of a man conducting an assessment, and then moved on when the assessment was sufficiently complete, and Willa filed him in the same part of her mind where she filed the temperature readings and the sales figures in the part that tracked patterns and waited for them to become clear. She asked Opal about him that afternoon when the market was done, and she and Opal were walking in the same direction for the first 3 blocks before their routes separated. Opal knew who he was in the way that people who run boarding houses and county seats know who everyone is because everyone passed through eventually, and the passing through was something she tracked with the same thoroughness she applied to her linen inventory. Silas Trent, she said. His family is from Lexington. His father was in land acquisition before him. She paused with the pause of a woman who is deciding how much of what she knows is useful to share. His father came through this valley about 35 years ago. He had an interest in some properties on the ridge. Willa walked and said nothing and let the sentence finish its own implications. Opal said nothing further. Willa walked home up the 3 miles to Stone Hollow Ridge, and by the time she reached the well, she had turned the information over 6 times from 6 different angles and had arrived at a provisional understanding of it, which was that Silas Trent had come to the Harlan market not to buy anything, but to look at what she was selling, and the looking was not casual. She did not yet know what he had concluded from the looking, but she knew the looking had happened, and she filed it in the ledger not on the pages with numbers, but on the blank page at the back that she had been keeping for information that did not yet have a category. He came back the following market Saturday. He did the same thing, the same walk, the same observation of her customers and her transaction volume. And this time she saw him speaking with a man at the eastern edge of the market who sold surveying equipment and who supplemented his income by doing the survey work himself when clients needed it. The conversation was brief and appeared to end with an agreement of some kind because the surveying man nodded in the way that people nod when they have confirmed an arrangement. 2 weeks later, walking back from a delivery to Opal's boarding house, Willa saw a man with surveying equipment on the slope below Stone Hollow Ridge. He was 300 yards from the well on the county road that skirted the base of the ridge, and he was working methodically with the transit and the measuring staff, recording elevations and distances and marking reference points with stakes he drove into the soft ground at the road's edge. He did not come onto her land. He stayed on the county road and worked from the road's edge, but the angles of his instrument were directed up the slope toward the ridge, and she understood what he was measuring and why. She said nothing to him. She walked past on the far side of the road and came home and descended to the cavity and checked the thermometer and checked the cheese and checked the mushroom logs and checked the root vegetable stores and wrote the temperature in the ledger and came back up and made her supper. The information went on the blank page at the back. In the winter of 1893, Mabel Finch was sick. The illness arrived the way most things arrived in Mabel's life, without ceremony or advance notice, because Mabel had never been the kind of woman to give any situation more acknowledgement than it had earned. Willa knew something was wrong, because Mabel did not appear at the well on a Thursday for the first time in 2 years, and by the second absence, Willa was walking the half-mile down the ridge to the farmhouse with its frowning porch. She found Mabel in her bedroom, which was the first time she had ever seen Mabel lying down during daylight hours. The illness was respiratory, the deep chest congestion that settled into the mountains in hard winters and worked through the elderly and the very young with a patience that matched its own. Mabel's color was not right. Her breathing was doing the work that breathing has to do when the lungs are compromised audible and labored each breath an effort rather than an automatic function. Willa made soup from the provisions in Mabel's kitchen and sat with her through the afternoon and returned the following morning before dawn, and the morning after that, and on the fourth morning, Mabel's fever broke in the way fevers sometimes broke suddenly and completely, the body having finally arrived at its own resolution of the battle it had been waging. It was during the fever on the second night that Mabel talked. She did not talk the way she normally talked. She talked the way people talk when the careful management of what they say has been temporarily suspended by temperature and exhaustion, when the economy of their ordinary speech gives way to the fuller accounting of things that have been held in storage for a long time. She talked about her first husband. She talked about her second husband and the mushroom logs and the long project of inoculating them that he had conducted in the summer before his death, which she described with the same precise clarity she brought to everything: the drilling of the holes in the bark and the insertion of the plugs in the ceiling with wax and the long wait that had finally ended in Willa's east wall. She talked about the cheese her mother had made and the recipe that had passed down through her hands to Willa's. And then she said a name. She said it in the middle of something else, in the middle of a sentence about the ridge and the winter and the property, and it was not a name Willa had heard before in this context. Trent, Mabel said. His father came in 1860, wanted the water and the ridge timber and the stone. She was looking at the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of someone seeing something other than the ceiling. Vera said no. He came back with a lawyer. Vera said no again. A pause. He tried to say the deed was invalid. Vera had the county clerk, and she had the original filing, and she had Douglas Marsh, who witnessed the original survey, and she had 30 years of tax receipts, every single one paid on time. Another pause. He went back to Lexington and told people that Vera Hale was a difficult woman. Vera considered that a compliment of the highest order. Willa sat in the chair beside Mabel's bed with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the ceiling. Silas was a boy then, Mabel said, 10 years old, came with his father once, stood in the yard and looked at the ridge the way his father looked at it. A sound that was almost a breath of laughter or something near enough to it. The looking runs in the family. Willa sat with this for a long time after Mabel's voice had settled back into the steady, difficult breathing of fever sleep. She sat with it and turned it over and placed it alongside what she already knew. The surveyor on the county road, the 2 visits to the market, the watching without buying the conversation with the surveying equipment vendor, and now this, the Trent family, and the property and the 1860 approach, and Vera's refusal, and the county clerk and the tax receipts, and 30 years of clear title. Silas Trent had not come to Harlan County for produce. He had come because his father had wanted this land 35 years ago and had been turned away by a woman who knew exactly what she had and exactly what she was entitled to under the law, and the land had passed to another woman who was also alone on it and also 4 years into operating from a position that any outside observer would describe as invisible. And Silas Trent had been waiting with the patience of a man who had been watching this particular situation for most of his adult life. Mabel recovered fully by February. By March, she was back on the well rim on Thursdays with her basket and her rope and her steady voice, and if she remembered anything she had said during the fever, she gave no indication of it, and Willa gave no indication that she had heard it. She kept it on the blank page at the back of the ledger. In the same February that Mabel was recovering, Willa was extending the south shelf. She had been working on the wall section for 3 days, chipping carefully in the direction of the corner where the south and east walls met, widening the existing shelf by 14 inches to accommodate the additional cheese wheels her expanding production required. The work required a different angle of approach than the earlier chiseling had required, and she had rigged the lantern on a second hook to give herself light from 2 directions instead of 1. She was working with the smaller chisel, the one better suited to detail work, in tight spaces when the blade caught under a protrusion in the rock face and she leveraged it with more force than she intended, and a section of the rock surface, approximately 8 inches square, broke away, cleanly exposing the fresh, pale stone beneath. She held the lantern close to examine the breakage and determine whether it required any repair or simply a smoothing of the edges. Beneath the broken section in the rock face that had been covered by the exterior layer for however many decades the exterior layer had been in place, she saw marks. She held the lantern closer. They were letters, carved into the limestone with a narrow point cut into the stone with the care of someone who was not in a hurry and understood that what they were putting into the rock was intended to stay there. The carving was clean and deliberate, each letter formed with the same unhurried precision. M.F. Below, the initials a year, 1847. Willa held the lantern against the rock face and looked at the initials for a long time. M.F. Mabel Finch. 1847, when Mabel Finch had been 19 years old, which was before her first husband, and before her second husband, and before the frowning porch, and before the 30 years of Thursdays with the basket and the rope. 19 years old and standing in this cavity in 1847, carving her initials into the limestone with whatever narrow point she had brought for the purpose. She moved the lantern. To the left of Mabel's initials higher on the wall, partially obscured by the same exterior layer that had covered Mabel's mark but visible through a natural crack in it, were more letters. V.H. 1849. Vera Hale. Willa moved the lantern further left systematically, now holding it close to the wall and moving it in slow horizontal passes, the way you read a page of text from left to right and then back again, 1 line lower. The wall spoke back. There were other marks. Some were clear. Some had been partially covered by the mineral deposits that accumulated on limestone surfaces over decades. But they were there, cut into the rock with the same deliberate care, the same unhurried intention. She could make out 4 additional sets of initials with certainty and 2 more that might have been initials or might have been natural fracture lines in the stone that the lamplight was interpreting as carving. The oldest date she could identify with confidence was 1821. She sat back on her heels on the cavity floor and held the lantern in both hands and looked at the wall. In 1821, Mabel had not been born. Vera had not been born. The Civil War was 40 years in the future. The county clerk who had written Willa's deed had not been born. The hackberry tree above the well had been a sapling or younger, and the cavity below it had been here as it was now at 54 degrees in the dark with the seeping water and the shelf and the iron hooks in the smooth dry floor. And in 1821, someone had come down and carved their initials into the wall, and the wall had kept them. The cavity was not Vera's discovery. It was not Mabel's. It was older than either of them, older than the oldest thing either of them had ever told her about, and the women who had found it before them had left the same mark that Willa was now looking at, the only mark a person could leave in a place that had no room for anything more than what was essential. Initials, a year, the minimum possible record of presence. We were here. We knew what this was. We used it, and we left it for whoever came next. She held the lantern steady for a long time and read the wall, and let the reading do what it did to her, which was considerable, and which she did not try to prevent or moderate or put into words, because some things happened in the dark at 54 degrees and were complete in themselves and did not require translation into any language that existed above ground. She climbed out before the lantern burned low and stood at the well rim in the February cold and looked at the ridge and the hackberry tree and the sky above it clear and cold and full of the particular stars of a mountain winter night. And she thought about 19 and Mabel Finch and 1847 and all the Thursdays since and the basket going up and down on the rope, and said nothing and went inside. She said nothing to Mabel the following Thursday. She brought the basket up and sent the basket down and listened to Mabel's voice coming down the shaft and responded to what was asked and mentioned nothing about the wall. But she noticed in a way she had not noticed before, with quite the same clarity, that Mabel had been coming to this well every Thursday for 2 years, had been lowering her basket and pulling it back up and sending information down the shaft in her level, unhurried voice, had been doing all of this with the particular quality of a woman fulfilling an obligation she had taken on and intended to complete, and that the obligation had a shape that was older and larger than Willa had previously understood. Silas Trent made his formal move in the spring of 1895. The document arrived at the Stone Hollow Ridge property by way of the Harlan County Sheriff's deputy, a young man who came up the ridge on a Monday morning with the expression of someone who had been given an assignment they would have preferred not to have, and who handed her the envelope with both hands in the manner of someone delivering something they considered potentially explosive. Willa took it and said thank you, and he rode back down the ridge, and she sat on the flat stone near the well and opened it. The document was 15 pages long, written in the legal language of Harlan County territorial property law, and it took her the better part of an hour to read through it completely, not because the language was beyond her, but because she read it as carefully as she read the temperature ledger, which was to say without skipping anything and without assuming she already knew what a sentence was going to say before she reached its end. The core of it, stripped of the architectural language of legal filing, was this. The original deed for the Stone Hollow Ridge quarter acre had been filed with the Harlan County Land Office in 1849, registered to Vera Hale, and containing among its standard provisions a clause that was standard in property registrations of that period in Kentucky, requiring that the land be actively cultivated and improved in a manner consistent with productive use. The clause was not unusual. It appeared in most deeds filed in that period and had in most cases been rendered moot by the obvious and continuous productive use that followed. Silas Trent's filing cited the clause and argued in the careful language of a man who had been preparing this argument for a long time that the productive use of the Stone Hollow Ridge property was not demonstrable in the conventional sense that the property contained no structures of significant investment, no cultivated fields, no agricultural improvements visible to external assessment. His filing requested that the Harlan County Property Commissioner conduct a formal review of the productive use status of the land under the terms of the 1849 deed provision. He was careful. He did not claim that the land was unproductive. He claimed only that the productivity could not be demonstrated through standard assessment methods and that under the terms of the deed, undemonstrated productivity was grounds for review. He had 60 days to make his case to the property commissioner. Willa had 60 days to answer it. She folded the document and placed it in her apron pocket and went down to the cavity and checked the temperature and checked the cheese and checked the mushroom logs, which were on their seventh flush since Mabel had brought them down, and she checked the root stores and wrote the temperature in the ledger and came back up. She sat on the flat stone again. The hackberry tree above the well was in full leaf, its sideways growth from the slope creating a canopy over the well opening that filtered the afternoon light into moving patches on the limestone rim. Juniper was in her pen conducting a philosophical assessment of the fence boards, as she did every afternoon, approaching the question with the same patience that had characterized her engagement with every problem she had encountered in the 4 years since Willa had walked her up from the valley. Willa looked at the ridge and the tree and the well and the pen and the goat and thought about Vera Hale in 1860, standing on the same ground with Silas Trent's father, making his approach and saying no with the county clerk behind her and the tax receipts in her hand, and Douglas Marsh, who had witnessed the original survey, standing somewhere nearby. She thought about what Vera had had: clear title, long payment history, a witness to the original filing. Then she thought about what she had, and the blank page at the back of the ledger began to fill itself. The blank page at the back of the ledger had always been the most important page in the book. Willa had understood this from the beginning, from the first week when she had designated it as the place for information that did not yet have a category, the place for observations that had not yet resolved into conclusions. She had filled it slowly over 4 years, adding entries in the same careful hand she used for the temperature readings and the sales figures. And by the spring of 1895, the page was nearly full, and what it contained was not a list of disconnected observations, but a complete picture of a situation that had been developing since before she arrived on Stone Hollow Ridge, and would continue to develop until it reached whatever resolution it was moving toward. She read the page twice, sitting on the flat stone with the hackberry tree filtering the afternoon light around her. Then she closed the ledger and went inside and made her supper, because thinking of the kind that needed doing could be done while the hands were occupied with something else, and the hands were always better for having something to do. She had 60 days. The first thing she did the following morning was walk to Mabel Finch's house. She arrived before 7, which was the hour when Mabel could be found in her kitchen and not yet committed to any particular project for the day, a narrow window that Willa had learned to use when she needed Mabel's full attention, rather than the partial attention of a woman already engaged in something. She knocked on the frame of the open door, and Mabel appeared from the direction of the stove with a coffee pot and 2 cups, which meant she had heard Willa coming up the slope and had made the relevant preparation, which was the kind of practical hospitality that Mabel had always offered, and which Willa had learned to receive without comment, because commenting on it would have embarrassed them both. She laid the document on Mabel's kitchen table, and Mabel read it the way she read everything, without expression, and at her own pace, her eyes moving through the legal language with the patience of a woman who had been reading things carefully for 60 years and had long since stopped being intimidated by formal prose. When she finished, she set the document down and drank her coffee. "He's been planning this a long time," she said. "Yes." His father tried the same approach in 1860. Vera beat it with clear title and payment history and a witness. Mabel set down her cup. "What do you have?" Willa told her. She told it in order and completely the same way she would have written it in the ledger if it had been a temperature reading or a sales figure, because precision was how you prevented misunderstanding, and she could not afford misunderstanding right now. She had the deed. She had 5 years of property tax receipts, everyone paid on time, continuing the payment history that Vera had maintained without interruption since 1849. She had the Saturday market records she had kept in the ledger, not for any legal purpose, but because she kept records of everything as a matter of professional practice, 4 years of weekly sales figures with dates and customer names and amounts. She had Opal Riggs and 8 other regular customers who had been buying from her consistently, and which she believed confirmed that buying and writing if asked. And she had something that Vera had not had in 1860, which was the Kentucky Property Statute of 1887, a provision that had been added to the code in response to land disputes in the eastern counties explicitly protecting the ownership rights of individuals who could demonstrate continuous, productive use of their land through documented income. Mabel listened to all of this without interrupting. When Willa finished, Mabel said, "You need a lawyer in Lexington, not in Harlan. Harlan is his territory. You need someone from outside the county who has no existing relationship with the Trent family." "I know one name," Willa said. "A woman named Aldous mentioned to me at the market last fall that there was a property attorney in Lexington who had handled two disputed claims in the eastern counties and won both of them. He didn't know her name." "I know her name," Mabel said. There was a pause of the kind that happened when Mabel said something that opened into a space larger than the sentence itself. "Her name is Constance Birch," Mabel said. "She was admitted to the Kentucky bar in 1881. She has an office on 2nd Street in Lexington. She charges $4 for an initial consultation." She paused again. Vera wrote to her once about another matter. She said the woman was precise and did not waste time on anything that did not advance the argument. Willa looked at Mabel across the kitchen table. Mabel picked up her coffee cup and said nothing further about how she came to know the name of a property attorney in Lexington, or why she had been keeping the information in the same storage facility where she kept everything else that might eventually be needed by someone who did not yet know they needed it. Willa wrote to Constance Birch that afternoon. She wrote 4 drafts before she was satisfied with the 5th, not because the facts were complicated, but because the order in which you presented facts to a person you had never met determined what conclusions they drew before they had heard all of them. And she wanted Constance Birch to have the complete picture before she formed any preliminary assessments. She described the property and the deed and the payment history. She described the Saturday market operation and the ledger records. She described Silas Trent in his filing in the 60-day window. She described the 1887 statute and her understanding of its applicability. She said she had $94 available for legal fees. She sent the letter by the Monday mail and waited. The response came on the following Thursday, which was 11 days, which meant that Constance Birch read correspondence quickly and responded to it with the same economy she apparently brought to everything else. The letter was one page written in a hand that was compact and regular and entirely without ornamentation, the hand of a person who wrote a great deal and saw no reason to make it take longer than necessary. Constance Birch confirmed that the 1887 statute was applicable. She confirmed that documented income from productive land use constituted valid evidence under its provisions. She said the weakness in Willa's position was not the statute, but the documentation, specifically whether the records she had described would satisfy the evidentiary standard required by the Harlan County Property Commissioner, who was a different audience than a circuit court judge and whose interpretations of the statute could vary with his relationships to the parties involved. She recommended obtaining written statements from, at minimum, 6 customers, stating their names, the dates of their purchases, and the amounts paid, and having those statements witnessed by a third party not connected to either side of the dispute. She recommended presenting these alongside the ledger records and the tax receipts in a single organized submission rather than as separate exhibits. She said the $94 was sufficient. She said she could be in Harlan in 3 weeks if Willa wanted to proceed. Willa wrote back the same afternoon and said she wanted to proceed. Then she went to see Opal Riggs. Opal was in her kitchen when Willa arrived, engaged in the daily accounting of a boarding house operation with the focused attention that accounting required, and she looked up from her ledger with the expression of a woman who had learned to read the meaning of unscheduled visits without needing them explained. Willa explained anyway because Opal deserved the full account. She told her about Silas Trent in the filing in the 60 days and Constance Birch in the statements she needed. She was direct and complete, and she did not soften anything because Opal Riggs had been feeding 12 men 3 times a day for 15 years and had not survived the operation by being protected from inconvenient information. Opal listened with her hands flat on her account book and her expression doing the controlled thing it did when she was processing something quickly and had not yet arrived at her position. When Willa finished, Opal said, "He came to my boarding house last fall, asked about the quality of the provisions I sourced locally. Very polite, very interested in whether I found them reliable over time." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the cheese and the mushrooms were the most reliable provisions I purchased from any source in Harlan County, and that I had never received a wheel or a basket that was not exactly what it was represented to be. She paused. He thanked me and left. He was building his argument that the productivity wasn't visible, Willa said. If even the primary customer couldn't describe the production operation, he could argue there was no demonstrable production operation to describe. Opal looked at her. That is a very careful man. He has been planning this for a long time. Opal closed her account book with the decisive motion of a woman who has completed one task and is moving to the next. Tell me what the statement needs to say. She had 8 signed statements within a week. Opal organized 5 of them herself, contacting the other regular customers with the brisk efficiency of a woman who ran 12 people's daily logistics and found the coordination of 8 written statements a comparatively minor administrative task. The remaining 3 Willa obtained herself, visiting each customer in person and explaining what was needed with the same directness she had used with Opal. Every one of them signed without hesitation. The hotel owner from the center of town, who had been buying 4 wheels per week for 3 years, added a sentence at the bottom of his statement that had not been requested, noting that the quality of the product had never varied from the first purchase to the most recent, and that in his professional experience, this level of consistency was rare and was the result of controlled production conditions that only someone who understood the craft at a high level could maintain. He said this, and Willa understood, because he was a man who had been serving guests from Lexington and Louisville for 20 years and knew what consistent quality required and respected it wherever he found it. She had never asked him to respect it and had never sought his opinion on the matter, but she received the addition to his statement with the acknowledgement it deserved and filed it in the ledger. Constance Birch arrived in Harlan on a Tuesday in June, which was the 38th day of the 60-day window. She was in her early 40s, a compact and self-possessed woman who carried her leather satchel the way a carpenter carried a tool bag, as an extension of what she did rather than a statement about it. She had the look of a person who had spent years in rooms where people had expected her not to be the most prepared person present and had formed the habit of being precisely that, not as a performance but as a professional standard she had set for herself and maintained because the alternative was less interesting. She reviewed Willa's complete documentation at Willa's kitchen table, and she reviewed it in silence. And in order, the deed first, then the tax receipts in chronological sequence, then the ledger with its 4 years of temperature readings and sales records, then the 8 customer statements. She made notes in the margins of her own copy in pencil, small and precise, the notes of a person building a structure from materials and checking each piece as it went into place. When she was done, she said, "The ledger is the foundation. Everything else supports the ledger. The ledger says this land has produced documented income every week for 4 years in increasing quantities from multiple verified buyers. The statute says that's sufficient. Our job is to make sure the property commissioner understands that the statute applies before Trent's attorney has the opportunity to argue that it doesn't." "What's his argument?" Willa asked. "His argument is that the productive use is not visible, that there are no cultivated fields, no orchards, no structures of obvious agricultural investment. He's going to say that a woman with a goat and a canvas sack is not a productive agricultural operation in any sense that a Kentucky property deed contemplated in 1849. Constance looked at her with the clear, direct gaze of a person who was not going to soften the difficulty of the situation, but was also not going to pretend it was larger than it was. "It's a reasonable argument on its face. Our job is to make sure the commissioner never gets to decide whether it's reasonable, because if he gets to decide it, his relationship to the Trent family in Lexington becomes a factor. How do we make sure he doesn't get to decide it? We file the counter submission before the deadline, and we file it as a statutory compliance determination request rather than a disputed claim. The distinction matters because a statutory compliance determination is a legal question with a defined answer, not a judgment call. The commissioner doesn't decide it. The language of the statute decides it. We are simply asking him to confirm what the statute already says." Constance made a note on her copy of the filing. "Trent's attorney will object to the framing. We will have already filed. The filing is on the record. The record is what matters." She filed on the 54th day. Willa was not in the room when it happened. Constance had told her there was no reason for her to be present at the filing, that the filing was a clerical act that required only the documents and the filer, and that Willa's time was better spent on Stone Hollow Ridge doing the work that the filing was describing. Willa accepted this assessment because it was correct and went back up the ridge and descended to the cavity and checked the temperature and checked the cheese and checked the mushroom logs and came back up and worked the afternoon. 54. 54. The cave held its temperature as it always had, independent of the proceedings in the Harlan County Property Commissioner's office, independent of the 60-day window and Silas Trent's 35 years of patience and Constance Birch's pencil notes in the margin of the counter-submission. It held at 54 because that was what it did. That was what it had always done. That was the single most important fact in the entire situation, and it had been true since before anyone alive had been born. The morning Silas Trent came to the property, Willa was at the Saturday market in Harlan. She learned what had happened when she returned from the man who farmed the valley property below the ridge and who had seen it from his upper pasture with the particular attention that rural neighbors paid to unusual events on adjacent land. He told her at the gate in the direct, factual manner of a man reporting information without editorial, the way the news of practical things was shared in Harlan County. A man and two other men had come up the ridge road on horseback shortly after 8 in the morning. They had dismounted at the property boundary and walked the quarter-acre in a systematic pattern, all three of them, and they had found the well with its hinged wooden cover, and they had opened it and looked down, and one of them had gone down on the rope using the rope Willa had left tied to the hackberry tree. The man had come back up after 10 minutes. Then all three of them had stood at the well for a while and then mounted their horses and ridden back down the ridge. One of them had written something in a book before they left, but the farming neighbor had not been close enough to see what. Willa walked up the slope to the well. The hinged cover was closed but not latched, which told her they had not known about the latch mechanism on the underside that she had installed specifically to prevent the cover from being opened from above without the knowledge of someone below. They had simply lifted it and descended and found what they found, which was nothing. She had moved everything 3 days ago. The warning had come from the man who sold surveying equipment at the Harlan market, who had told Opal Riggs, who had sent word up the ridge by way of the boy who delivered the weekly mail, that Silas Trent had been asking about the property access road and the best time of day for a visit. The information had been passed with no particular urgency, simply as a piece of news that might be relevant to the person. It concerned the way information moved in Harlan County through the web of small obligations and mutual attention that held communities together in the absence of formal communication systems. Willa had spent the evening of the day the warning arrived moving every item from the cavity to the root cellar of Mabel's farmhouse, which was not as cold as the cavity, but was cold enough for the short term and had the overwhelming advantage of being half a mile away from any place Silas Trent had reason to look. 43 trips on the rope with the pulley system working at its maximum load capacity, the cheese wheels wrapped individually in their cloth, the mushroom harvest in flat baskets covered with linen, the root vegetables in their sawdust crates. She had cleaned the cavity floor afterward with a stiff brush and the water from the seeping basin, removing the marks of sustained use as thoroughly as the stone surface allowed. She had taken the thermometer off its hook. She had carried the lantern up. She had closed the hinged cover and latched it from below, and then climbed back up the outer shaft wall using the foothold she had chiseled years ago and replaced the cover from above. From the outside, the well was a dry well. From below the cavity was an empty natural limestone formation of no commercial or agricultural significance. She had then walked down to Mabel's house in the dark and reported what she had done because Mabel needed to know the root cellar was temporarily occupied by the full inventory of the Stone Hollow Ridge operation, and because there was something satisfying about reporting it to Mabel, who received the information with the expression she wore when something had been done correctly, and she was confirming this internally. Now standing at the well rim in the late Saturday afternoon, she read the disturbed surface around the well, opening the boot prints in the soft soil where 3 men had stood, the shallow marks where a rope had been pulled taut against the well rim's edge, the small displacement of the hackberry tree's exposed roots where someone had set a heavy hand against the trunk. She read it the way she read the temperature ledger, systematically and without rushing. Then she went inside and wrote in the blank page at the back, visited, found nothing left. Silas Trent's response to the counter-submission came through the property commissioner's office on the 43rd day after the filing. The commissioner had determined in the language of the official notification that the documentation submitted by Willa Hale in support of the statutory compliance determination request met the evidentiary standard established by the 1887 Kentucky Property Statute. The commissioner had further determined that no basis existed for the review of productive use status requested in the original filing by Silas Trent, as the documented evidence of continuous income from the property was sufficient under the statutory language to satisfy the productive use requirement of the original deed provision. The claim was dismissed. Constance Birch sent a copy of the dismissal to Stone Hollow Ridge with a note in her compact handwriting that said the matter was concluded and that the documentation Willa had assembled was the cleanest evidentiary record she had encountered in a property dispute in 15 years of practice. Willa read the dismissal and the note at the kitchen table in the morning light and felt the conclusion of the thing settle into the space around her with the same quality of finality that the cavity's temperature had, a settling that was not dramatic because it was complete. There was no residue to it. It was simply done resolved by the weight of 4 years of records and 8 customer statements and the plain language of a statute that said what it said without apology. She wrote the outcome in the ledger in the column for notable events and went down to the cavity to retrieve her thermometer from the root cellar where she had placed it with the rest of the inventory and rehung it on its hook, and she read the temperature. 54. She brought everything back down from Mabel's root cellar that same afternoon. Mabel Finch died in the spring of 1901. She died the way she had lived on her own terms and on her own schedule on a Tuesday morning in April, when the ridge was showing its first real green of the season and the hackberry tree had put out the beginning of its new leaves. Willa found her in the chair on the frowning porch at mid-morning when she came down for their regular Thursday visit, which had been moved this particular week because Mabel had not been well, and Willa had been checking on her daily rather than weekly. She was in the chair with her hands resting on its arms, in the position of rest they always occupied, and she looked more peaceful than she had looked in the months of the previous winter's slow decline, when breathing had become a conscious effort and the face had taken on the particular cast of sustained work. She looked like a woman who had finished what she was doing and had sat down. Willa sat on the porch with her for a while before she went for anyone. She sat with the spring morning around her and the ridge above and the mountains beyond the ridge, and Mabel's hands on the chair arms in the stillness they had finally reached, and she let the sitting be what it was. She had known Mabel Finch for 10 years, which was half her life as an adult and more than half of the life she had lived on Stone Hollow Ridge, and the knowing had been entirely of the kind that Mabel had permitted, which was the knowing of actions and judgments and consistent presence over a sustained period, never the knowing of stated feelings or expressed needs or any of the interior territory that Mabel had maintained as her own throughout. Willa had learned more about Mabel from the things she had done without explanation than from anything she had ever said, and the total of what she had done without explanation was considerable. The arrangement for the burial and the county notifications took 3 days, and on the 4th day after Mabel's death, the county executor arrived at the farmhouse to document the estate, which was not large. The farmhouse and the land it sat on, the livestock, the contents of the barn, the tools, the furniture, the provisions, and the will which Mabel had filed with the county clerk in 1898, and which the executor produced from his case with the same administrative matter-of-factness he brought to every other document in the proceeding. Mabel had left the farmhouse and the land to Willa. The executor read the relevant provision, and Willa listened to it and said nothing, and he moved on to the next item in the proceeding, and the leaving was accomplished in a sentence the way everything Mabel had ever given had been accomplished quietly and without requiring a response. The note was at the bottom of the will document, added in Mabel's hand rather than the executor's, which meant she had written it herself at the time of the filing, and the executor had attached it as a codicil. It said, "You were the best neighbor I ever had, and you lived in a hole in the ground." Willa kept it in her mother's sewing kit for the rest of her life. She spent the next 3 days going through Mabel's house with the systematic attention she applied to everything, not to assess the value of what she was inheriting, but because the house needed to be understood, the way the cavity had needed to be understood room by room, item by item, in the order that the rooms presented themselves. She was methodical and unhurried, and she opened every drawer and every cabinet and every storage space, not out of sentiment, but out of the practical respect of a person who understood that what was left behind deserved to be seen clearly before it was sorted. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was working through the contents of the small writing desk in Mabel's front room The desk she had seen Mabel use on perhaps 6 occasions over 10 years, always for specific purposes. A payment that needed to be made by post, a letter to the county clerk, once a piece of correspondence she had sealed and addressed before Willa arrived, and that Willa had not been offered any information about. The top two drawers held the things a writing desk was expected to hold. Paper pencils, a small bottle of dried ink, a folded map of Harlan County that was 20 years old and still accurate for the things that did not change. The third drawer held a small stack of letters tied with kitchen twine, the letters Mabel had received over decades and had kept for reasons of her own. And beneath the letters, flat against the drawer's base, an envelope. The envelope was sealed and had been sealed for a long time, the glue having darkened with age to the color of the craft paper around it. It was addressed in a hand Willa recognized immediately, the careful, upright letters of a woman who had learned penmanship at a time when penmanship was considered a form of respect for the person who would receive the writing. The hand was Vera Hale's. The envelope was addressed to Mabel Finch. There was no postmark, which meant it had been delivered by hand rather than by post. In the upper corner, in the same hand, a date, September 1887. Willa held the envelope and turned it in the lamplight and looked at the date, September 1887. Vera had been alive in September 1887. She would die in the spring of 1889, but in September of 1887 she had been alive and had written this letter and sealed it and given it to Mabel Finch rather than mailing it, which meant she had given it in person, and Mabel had kept it in the back of her writing desk for 14 years, through Vera's death and the filing of the deed in Willa's name and 10 years of Thursdays at the well. She opened the envelope carefully, working the flap loose at the edges where the old glue had already begun to separate naturally, and she unfolded the single sheet inside and held it to the lamp. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. Vera Hale had never been a woman who used more words than the situation required. The first paragraph concerned the property. It described what Vera wanted done with the deed when she was gone, which was to ensure that it went to Willa and not to Della, and the reasons for this, which were stated with the same direct economy that had characterized everything Vera had ever said or written. Della had Everett Crane and the store and the foundations. Della would be provided for. Willa had nothing visible and would need something hidden, and the hidden thing was the quarter-acre and the well and what was below the well, and Mabel knew what it was and what it could do, and Mabel should make sure the right person found it. The second paragraph was shorter. It said, "I have watched this child since she was small enough to sit in my kitchen and not touch anything without being told she could, and she is the kind of person who understands what things are worth without being told, which is the rarest quality I know of in a person. The cave has been waiting for someone like her since before either of us was born. See that she finds it. I trust you to know when to give her the rope and when to leave her to climb." Willa sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Outside the farmhouse windows, the ridge was dark and the spring night was moving in from the mountains, and the hackberry tree on the quarter-acre above was a shape against the sky that she could not see from here, but knew was there as it had always been there, sideways and crooked, and holding its position over the well opening, with the patient authority of something that had been doing the same thing for longer than anyone's memory reached. She thought about September 1887, which was 2 years before Vera died, and 4 years before she herself arrived on Stone Hollow Ridge, which meant that when Vera wrote this letter, she had been planning something that would not come to its completion for 4 more years, that she had been looking forward across 4 years of uncertainty and had seen what she expected to see at the end of them, and had made the arrangements accordingly. She thought about Mabel on the well rim every Thursday for 10 years, lowering the basket and pulling it back up and talking down the shaft in the same level voice, doing the things she had been trusted to do, giving the rope when the rope was needed, and leaving the climbing to the person who needed to do the climbing, fulfilling an obligation that was 14 years old when Willa found the letter, and that Mabel had never once mentioned. She thought about the initials on the cavity wall, MF 1847, VH 1849, the names going back to 1821. The women who had been here before and had left the minimum possible record of their presence and had gone on leaving the cave at 54 degrees in the dark to wait for whoever came next with the understanding and the need. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it in the envelope, and put the envelope in her apron pocket, and she sat in the lamplight of Mabel's front room and let the full weight of what she understood arrive and be understood, which took some time, and she gave it the time it needed because some things deserve to be received slowly. In the morning, she walked back up to the quarter acre and descended to the cavity and checked the temperature and checked the cheese and checked the mushroom logs and wrote the reading in the ledger. 54, unchanging. As it had been in 1821 and in 1847 and in 1849 and in 1863, when Vera lowered a wounded soldier into the dark and kept him at 54 degrees until he could walk out on his own. As it had been on the 19th of August, 1891, when Willa had first held a candle in this space and understood that she had found something. As it would be tomorrow and the year after, and in whatever time followed the last days she spent on this ridge. She went back up and got on with the day. The years from 1901 to 1905 were the years of full knowledge. She had always worked with competence, but competence and full knowledge were different conditions, and she understood the difference, clearly now. The way you understand a room differently when you know not only its dimensions but its history, not only how it is arranged now, but all the arrangements that preceded the current one and the intention behind each of them. The cave was hers, and it had been given to her deliberately by a woman who had understood her before she had understood herself, and the giving had been accomplished through the careful, patient work of another woman who had spent 14 years as the instrument of the gift, without ever claiming credit for it, and the whole structure of it, the deed and the letter, and the Thursday visits, and the basket going up and down on the rope, was the most considered act of generosity she had ever encountered. And she held it the way she held everything that mattered, which was without display and without diminishment. She expanded the operation in those 4 years with the confidence of a person who has stopped waiting for permission she never needed. She added a third row of mushroom logs along the east wall when the original logs had given their last flush and been carried out to become garden compost. She deepened the seeping water basin by another 4 inches, giving it a capacity that could sustain 3 additional cheese wheels through the aging cycle simultaneously. She improved the smoke pipe with a clay lining she applied to the interior surface of the section, reducing turbulence and improving the distribution of smoke through the cavity in a way that was visible in the quality of the cured meat, which became darker and more consistent across the full length of each cut. Her annual income in 1904 was $93. In the spring of 1905, she received an offer. It came by letter from a man in Lexington who said he represented a timber interest with business in Harlan County and who had heard through what he described as standard inquiry that there was a quarter acre on Stone Hollow Ridge with a hackberry tree of notable size whose timber might be of interest to his client. He offered $40 for the property in its entirety, all structures, the well, and the land itself. $40 was nearly 300 times the annual tax value of the property. It was also, she understood, without sentimentality, the correct offer at the correct time. She was 34 years old. She had been on the ridge for 14 years. The cave had given her everything it had to give, and she had given it everything she had to give back, and the accounting between them was complete and balanced in the way that genuine exchanges arrived at balance when both parties had been honest about the transaction. The cave would be here after she left. It would be here after whoever bought the hackberry tree left, because $40 for timber did not include any consideration for what was 31 feet below the surface and had not been visible to anyone in 60 years and would not be visible to anyone who did not already know to look. She wrote to the Lexington man and said she would accept the offer. She spent the following 2 weeks completing the final accounting of the operation, the inventory of the equipment she would take with her, which was not much, and the inventory of what she would leave, which was the cave itself cleaned and emptied and returned to what it had been before she arrived, or as close to that as 14 years of sustained use could be reversed. She carried out the mushroom logs that had given their last flush. She carried out the root vegetable crates. She left the iron hooks in the ceiling where they were because they had been there since before her and belonged to the rock that held them. She left the natural basin in the south corner, full of the seeping water that had always filled it. She left the shelf she had extended and the footholds she had chiseled into the shaft below the laidstone section. She took the thermometer. She took the hammer. The hammer was the thing she hesitated over longest, not because she was uncertain about taking it, but because taking it required acknowledging what it had been, which was the primary instrument of everything the cave had become during her tenure. 40 cents at the Harlan General Store in August 1891. It had chiseled the entry ledge and widened the shelf and driven the additional hooks into the ceiling and shaped the footholds, and in 14 years of sustained use had earned back its price more times than she had ever bothered to calculate, which was the only appropriate relationship to have with a tool that worked. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and put it in the canvas sack. On the last evening before the transaction was completed, she descended to the cavity one final time. She went down in the late afternoon after the surface work was done, and before the light failed entirely above, so that she had the natural twilight from the well opening above her until she reached the 26-foot mark, where the shaft opened into the cavity and the lantern became necessary. She brought the lantern and the hammer and the cold chisel and nothing else. The cavity was clean and empty at 54 degrees, the iron hooks on the ceiling and the shelf in the south wall, and the seeping water in its basin, the only evidence that the space had been anything other than a natural limestone formation below a dry well on a quarter-acre of Harlan County ridge. She held the lantern to the south wall and read the names. In 1821, someone whose initials she had never been able to make out with certainty, the carving partially obscured by a mineral deposit that had accumulated over 80 years. Then others, some clear and some partially, covered the record of women who had found this place and used it and marked their presence in the only way the stone allowed. MF in 1847, Mabel Finch at 19 years old with the rest of her life still ahead of her, and VH in 1849. Vera Hale beginning the 30 years of sustained use that had kept her and her family and at least one wounded soldier through everything the world had brought against them. Willa held the lantern steady with her left hand and took the hammer in her right and set the cold chisel against the stone at the level of Vera's mark 4 inches to the right of the V, 1849 in the clear space that had no marks in it yet, and that she had been looking at for 14 years without knowing she was looking at it as the place where her own mark would go. She struck the chisel with the hammer. The sound filled the cavity and came back from the far wall a half-second later, and she did not stop. She worked the chisel steadily through the strokes that each letter required the curves and the straight lines of the initials she had been writing in the ledger at the top of every page for 14 years, 2 letters and 4 numbers. The minimum possible record, the same record that everyone who had come before her had left, no more and no less. WH. She set the chisel against the stone again and cut the first numeral, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, each one deliberate and even. 1905. When it was done, she held the lantern close to the wall and looked at what she had made. The fresh cuts were pale against the older stone, the limestone, showing its interior color, where she had broken the surface white and clean against the darker weathered face of the wall. The letters were even, and the numbers were even, and the whole of it occupied 4 inches of rock face that had been waiting for it since whenever the last person before her had made their mark. She looked at all the marks together, the 1821 initials at the left partially obscured by time, then the others moving across the wall in the chronological order of their making, each set in a different hand, each expressing the same essential information in the same minimal form. We were here. We knew what this was. We used it for what it was for, and we left it. The wall held them all at 54 degrees in the dark, and would continue to hold them after she left, after the hackberry timber was cut and carried down the mountain. And the new owner who had bought the property for the timber filled the well with gravel and went back to Lexington after the property changed hands again and again in the decades that followed after everyone she had ever known was gone. The names would still be in the wall. The temperature would still be 54. The seeping water would still fill the natural basin in the south corner and drain away through the crack in the floor into whatever darkness lay below. She blew out the lantern and stood in the absolute dark for a moment with the hammer in her hand and the smell of fresh limestone from the new carving around her and the 54 degrees on her face and her hands and the back of her neck. The dark and the temperature and the mineral smell of Harlan County limestone at depth were the same as they had been on the day she had first held a candle in this space, and they were the same as they had been in 1849 when Vera Hale had first extended a lamp into this cavity and understood what she had found, and they were the same as they had been in 1821 when the first initials had been cut into the wall, and they would be the same tomorrow, and in 50 years and in 100 years, and the cave did not require her presence or anyone's presence to maintain itself, because it was not a thing that had been built or maintained. It was a thing that simply was. She lit the lantern and climbed out. At the surface, the evening was coming in from the mountains in the way Harlan County evenings came in late in the year, the light going horizontal and gold above the ridgeline, and the shadows reaching down from the trees across the quarter acre with the long, unhurried quality of shadow at the end of a clear day. The hackberry tree's canopy caught the last of the direct light and held it in its new spring leaves the same sideways posture it had always held the crooked arm over the well opening, unchanged from the first time she had seen it, and unmoved by the fact that it would be felled in the next week for the timber it contained. She stood at the well rim and closed the hinged cover for the last time and latched it from above. She picked up the canvas sack with the hammer in it and the thermometer wrapped in cloth beside the hammer and walked to the edge of the quarter acre and looked back once. The property was exactly what it appeared to be. A quarter acre on the back slope of Stone Hollow Ridge in Harlan County, Kentucky. A hackberry tree, a covered well, a small room built from the boards of an old chicken coop, its walls sealed with gray clay, its window facing the ridge. A patch of grass where the hackberry's roots had kept the soil thick. From here, from this angle, in this light, there was nothing to see. There had never been anything to see. That was the point. That had always been the point from 1821 to this evening in 1905, through every season, and every woman who had found this place and understood it and used it and left it. The invisibility was not a coincidence, and it was not an accident. It was the entire design, the one feature of the quarter acre that no amount of surveying or legal filing or deliberate inspection could change because it was not a feature of the surface at all. It was what was below. She walked down the ridge for the last time with the canvas sack over her shoulder and the coins from the sale in her coat pocket and the thermometer and the hammer wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the sack, and she did not look back again because there was nothing behind her that she needed to see one more time. The well was 31 feet deep. The cavity below it held at 54 degrees. The names on the south wall would remain exactly as she had left them in the dark in the constant temperature that no season could touch for as long as the ridge stood above them. MF 1847, VH 1849, WH 1905, and the older marks before them going back to 1821, each one the signature of a woman who had known what she had and used it fully and passed it on, which was to say for a very long time.